The heavy oak doors slam shut behind her as the courtroom falls into a stifled hush. All eyes fix on the modest black woman standing alone before the polished mahogany bench. Her shoulders drawn back, but her fingers trembling slightly at her side. Judge Halvorsen narrows his cold, piercing gaze at her, his voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel. State your name again, and this time try to pronounce it like a professional. The room titters with restrained laughter, and the woman pauses for a breath, composing herself beneath the weight of centuries-old condescension now embodied in the gavel-wielding man before her. My name is Adana Okwuosa. She replies with quiet pride, her accent colored gently by her Nigerian roots, musical yet firm, soft yet unshakably dignified. Halvorsen sneers, "You expect this court to take testimony seriously from someone who sounds like they learned English yesterday." The words land like slaps in the air, and a hush of stunned discomfort spreads through the room. Adana, 42, a middle school English teacher with tight coils pinned neatly beneath a navy head wrap, stands unmoving. She's dressed simply a gray cardigan, buttoned over a blouse with delicate floral embroidery and sensible black slacks. Her skin is rich brown, her eyes deep and knowing with a gentle sadness that masks an unyielding fire. Born in Enugu, she emigrated to the United States at 23, earned 2 master's degrees, and has been lauded as an exceptional educator in underserved communities. Today, she's here not as a defendant, not as a plaintiff, but as a witness in a wrongful eviction case affecting a family. She tutors voluntarily, but none of that matters to the judge whose gavel weighs more than her words in this room, whose robe shields his prejudice behind layers of authority. People like you should learn to speak properly before trying to lecture anyone, he says with venomous amusement, flipping through her written statement without reading a word. A bailiff smirks, the court reporter avoids her gaze, and the landlord's attorney chuckles openly emboldened. Adana's chest tightens, her breath shallow, as a rising pressure builds behind her sternum. Not just from this moment, but from every unspoken slight. Every time a colleague mispronounced her name deliberately, every parent-teacher meeting where her competence was questioned by subtle tones and raised eyebrows. She thinks of her students, many first-generation kids like her, who mimic her cadence with pride, who say she gives them the words to tell their stories. She cannot falter now. Your Honor. She begins again, but Halvorsen cuts her off, his gavel thudding. Enough, the court will disregard her statement. A stunned silence. The family she came to support gasps softly behind her. Her mouth goes dry, and then the door at the rear of the courtroom creaks open. Heads turn. A collective murmur ripples like wind through tall grass. A tall, suited man strides in, graceful, commanding his presence, filling the room with sudden gravity. Barack Obama, the former president. No security detail. No entourage, just him moving with quiet force toward the bench. Judge Halvorsen's jaw tightens, unsure whether to stand or assert control. Obama speaks calmly, but with the weight of the republic in his voice. I'm here to offer a character statement for Ms. Okwuosa, he says, hands clasped before him. The courtroom blinks, stares. You know this witness. The judge stammers. Indeed I do. Obama replies, we met last year at a literacy initiative I hosted. She's one of the most effective educators I've encountered. Her curriculum has increased reading scores among immigrant students across 5 states. She's also the reason 2 students testified in a recent congressional subcommittee on educational equity. Murmurs erupt. The bailiff stiffens. Halverson's cheeks blotch red. Her accent. Obama continues. His eyes cutting through the air is not a flaw. It's a thread in the fabric of what makes this country resilient. Her voice is the voice of millions who came here, not because it was easy, but because it was possible. And if this court cannot respect that, then it disrespects the Constitution. The silence that follows is profound, like the pause before a storm or the breath before a revelation. Adana, motionless, feels the tide shift in her chest. Not validation, she didn't need it, but recognition. Her humanity, so easily dismissed a moment ago now, framed in the light of truth. Judge Halverson, visibly, rattled fumbles with his papers. I was unaware, he mutters a half apology, hanging lifeless in the air. Obama nods, stepping back beside Adana, offering her a small, knowing smile. Ms. Okuosa, please continue. The judge's voice suddenly smaller. Adana lifts her chin and reads her statement. Not for the judge now, but for the mother wiping tears behind her. For the child gripping her backpack with trembling fingers. For every teacher with an accent who's been told their voice doesn't belong. Her voice doesn't quiver. Every syllable lands with purpose and her accent becomes a symphony of strength. When she finishes, the courtroom sits silent, humbled. As she steps away, the mother wraps her in an embrace, sobbing. You saved us. Outside, reporters swarm. Questions fly. Obama places a hand on Adana's shoulder. Never let them shame the sound of your roots, he says. That night, clips of the courtroom scene go viral. Social media erupts with Her Accent Matters and Okuosa Speaks. Schools request her curriculum. A foundation is established in her name to support immigrant educators, and Judge Halverson. He's quietly removed from the case. The ending isn't a fairy tale. It's not about revenge, it's about restoration. A system that bent, then briefly broke, now sees a sliver of repair. Not because justice came from power, but because dignity stood unshaken in the storm. The message echoes in classrooms, homes, and courtrooms across the nation. The value of a voice isn't in how it sounds, but in the truths it dares to speak. Weeks pass, and though the courtroom spectacle fades from headlines, the ripple it caused continues to spread like light through stained glass. Adana Okuosa returns to her classroom the next Monday, greeted by a hallway lined with handmade posters. Your voice taught us we love your accent. Teach loud his. Oh, her students, a mosaic of backgrounds. Honduran, Haitian, Vietnamese, Nigerian. And more rush to her with open arms, their small faces beaming with pride. Not only in her, but in themselves. Miss O says Jordan, a soft-spoken boy who used to mumble through every oral presentation. My mom said you're famous now. She smiles and kneels to meet his eyes. I'm not famous, Jordan. I'm just not invisible anymore. That evening, Adana logs into her email and finds over 4,000 unread messages. One is from a professor at Columbia University inviting her to speak at a symposium on linguistic prejudice. Another is from the White House's Office of Public Engagement, requesting her insight on educational reforms for immigrant communities. But the one that makes her pause is short and plain. I'm sorry I was wrong. I'm learning. H. She stares at it for a long time. Judge Halverson. No signature, no grand apology, but an acknowledgement. A start. In the weeks that follow, Adana gives interviews not to boast, but to teach. On NPR, she speaks of how prejudice often wears polished shoes and speaks with perfect diction. On Good Morning America, she tells the nation that dignity doesn't depend on accent, origin, or skin respect. She says into the camera is not earned by speaking like you, but by daring to speak at all when the world tries to silence you. Her story becomes a featured case study in law schools and teacher colleges taught under the theme, When Language Becomes a Wall and How to Break It Down. Meanwhile, the students she inspired begin to find their own courage. Jordan, the shy boy, wins first place in a state poetry contest with a spoken word piece titled My Mother's Tongue. It is raw and rhythmic, filled with proud mispronunciations and unapologetic culture. Another student, Nye, forms a club called Voices of Us, where kids rehearse speeches in their native rhythms encouraged to speak, not erase their origins. Barack Obama, quietly watching from afar, writes a final public letter posted to his website titled The Sound of America. In it, he honors Adana and others like her. They told her she sounded foreign. What they didn't understand was, so does freedom to those who've never heard it sung with courage. Adana is later invited to Congress where she testifies on the floor about the importance of representation in education. Standing before rows of suits and stares, she delivers her speech in the same accent the judge once mocked. She does not slow down. She does not change her tone. And when the chamber stands to applaud, many with tears in their eyes, she knows this was never just about her voice. It was about giving permission for others to use theirs. Years later, a mural appears on the side of a school in Baltimore. It shows Adana Okwuosa surrounded by children, her head wrap flowing like a banner. At the bottom, a quote in bold letters. Your accent is not a flaw. It is the echo of your ancestors and the music of your fight. And when a child, decades from now, is mocked for sounding different in a classroom somewhere in America, the teacher will say, Let me tell you a story about a woman named Adana and the day the world finally listened. But as the years unfold, Adana's impact doesn't fade. It multiplies, threading itself into the very fabric of change. The National Education Board launches a new initiative titled Accent Equity. Built around her advocacy mandating cultural competency training for all public educators and legal professionals. Her face appears not on magazine covers, but in school murals and library posters. Beside the words, language is not a limitation, it is a legacy. Yet for Adana, glory was never the goal. She returns each fall to her humble classroom in D.C., room 208, with its scuffed desks and creaky windows, where she still brings in extra snacks for kids who come to school. Hungry still stays late, helping parents who struggle with forms in languages they can't yet read, and still teaches grammar not as a set of rigid rules, but as a bridge to understanding without shaming where someone begins. But something has changed now when she speaks at conferences or community panels. People lean in. They no longer correct her pronunciation. They ask for her guidance. She receives letters from children across the country, many with names like hers, once mispronounced and mocked, who now say things like, "You made me proud of how my dad speaks," or "I stopped hiding my grandma's stories because of you." One snowy January morning, a package arrives at her door. Inside is a letter written in the flowing hand of Michelle Obama. It reads, "Your work is what we hoped for when we said, 'Yes, we can.' You turned hurt into heritage and silence into song. Barack, and I thank you from the bottom of our hearts." Folded beneath the letter is a medal from the Obama Foundation's annual Citizens of Light Award. She holds it with trembling hands, then quietly places it in her desk drawer beside a drawing from her student Mina that reads, Miss O is my voice, but not everyone celebrates. There are talk show hosts who mock her on air, pundits who call her overrated commenters online, who type "Speak English" under her interviews. But this time she's not alone. Thousands speak up for her teachers, students, parents, veterans, even celebrities. A popular singer samples her courtroom speech into a protest anthem. When a local judge is caught berating another immigrant witness months later, Adana is invited on a national broadcast to respond. She doesn't scold or retaliate. Instead, she tells a story about her grandfather, who taught her that words could build nations or burn them down. We must choose, she says, her voice calm, whether we use our words to wound or to welcome. And then, in her 50th year, something unexpected happens. She receives an invitation from Harvard to become a guest lecturer for their graduate program in education and cultural linguistics. She hesitates. At first, she doesn't seek prestige, but a student back home writes her a note. If you go, we'll all go with you because you're our path forward. So she accepts. Her first lecture is standing room only. Students record every word. She doesn't alter her speech for academia. She opens with a Yoruba proverb. The voice that speaks truth doesn't shout. One day, on a crisp fall afternoon, she walks across Harvard Yard as the leaves turn red and gold. A young girl approaches her bright-eyed, nervous. "Excuse me," she says, "are you Adana Okuosa?" Adana smiles. "Yes." The girl looks down, then meets her eyes. "I used to hate how my mom talked, but I watched your video with my dad. And now I think it's beautiful." She runs off embarrassed, but Adana watches her disappear into the crowd, her heart quietly full. And that night, back in her quiet home, after the lectures, after the applause, after the history she's helped rewrite, she sits at her window sipping tea. Rain taps gently against the glass. She thinks of that first day in court, of the shame that tried to shrink her voice, and of the storm it accidentally woke. And she whispers into the night as if speaking to the girl she once was. You were always enough. Years roll on, and Adana Okwosa's name begins appearing in places she never imagined. Not in lights or billboards, but in lesson plans, in teacher training handbooks, and in whispered stories told by immigrant mothers to their children at bedtime. She becomes a symbol, not of celebrity, but of resilience. In South Carolina, a young boy named Malik defends his Guatemalan classmate from a bully by quoting her courtroom speech verbatim. In Oregon, a teacher with a thick Polish accent pins Adana's picture on the classroom wall with the words, "Courage looks like this." And in a rural school in Mississippi, a principal changes the morning announcements policy to allow students to greet the school in any language they speak at home. When a reporter asks what inspired it, the principal answers, "I saw what one voice did in that courtroom. And I thought, what if every child believed their voice mattered too?" Adana, now 60 and silver-haired beneath her colorful head wraps, still teaches, but her classroom is now global. Through virtual seminars, mentorship programs, and workshops that span time zones, she coaches thousands of educators in embracing language diversity as strength. Her curriculum is adopted by dozens of school districts nationwide. One afternoon, she's invited to speak at the United Nations on the International Day of Education. Standing before the flags of 193 nations, she addresses a hall of diplomats, educators, and young leaders. Colonialism didn't just take land. It taught us to be ashamed of how we speak. But when we reclaim our accents, we reclaim our stories. The hall erupts in applause. But Adana simply bows her head with humility, the applause echoing like distant thunder, warm but never overwhelming her purpose. Meanwhile, Judge Halverson quietly retires from the bench. After public scrutiny increases over a pattern of dismissiveness toward non-native speakers. No formal disgrace, no scandal. Just a slow fade as the world begins to outgrow men like him. He sends Adana another letter this time. Longer, more thoughtful, acknowledging not just his insult, but the deeper ignorance behind it. She writes back, not with forgiveness, but with truth. Change is not apology. It's what you do with the years that follow. One winter, Adana returns to Nigeria for the first time in decades. She walks the red earth roads of Enugu, her homeland, where neighbors still remember the bright girl who once read Shakespeare aloud beneath mango trees. At the village school she once attended barefoot. The headmaster leads her to a new library built with donations from supporters around the world, named the Okwosa Center for Language and Dignity. On the wall is a quote she once spoke in court. Dignity does not require translation. As the sun sets over the hills of her childhood, she sits quietly beneath a jacaranda tree surrounded by local children eager for stories. She begins not with grand speeches, but in the gentle cadence of her mother tongue. The children lean in close eyes wide, hanging on every word. Her voice once mocked, once doubted, now sings across the air like birds returning home. And far away, back in Washington, D.C., a teacher with a heavy accent stands before her class, nervous. Before she begins, she presses play on a video. Adana's voice fills the room. The teacher smiles. She is no longer afraid, because now, every time someone hears an unfamiliar accent in a courtroom, a classroom, a news report, or a quiet conversation, they don't just hear the words. They remember the story. They remember the woman who stood tall when the world tried to shrink her. They remember Adana Okwuosa, and they listen. And still, the legacy of Adana Okwuosa deepens, not like the blazing flash of a headline, but like the steady roots of a tree that will not fall. 10 years have passed since the courtroom gavel tried to silence her, and now Adana is preparing to retire, not from the work, but from the title of teacher. The news spreads quickly. Her former students, now engineers, poets. City council members and young parents begin sending video messages, thousands of them. One by one, they tell stories not about perfect grades or flawless grammar, but about how her voice gave them permission to embrace their own "you made me believe that broken English can still carry truth." Says one. You showed me that how I speak is who I am, not who I lack. The mayor of D.C. declares her final teaching week as Adana Okwuosa Language Justice Week, and schools across the city hold assemblies where students perform poems and plays in their home languages. When asked if she'll attend the final celebration, Adana simply smiles and says, I will be where I've always been listening. But her final day of class is not silent. Her classroom is packed not only with students but with alumni journalists, her grown children, and even quiet observers from the Department of Education. A hush falls as she walks in. On the board, written in multicolored chalk, are the words, "Speak as you are." Miss O taught us that she teaches that day as she always has, with passion, humor, and deep empathy. But her closing words are different. She lifts her eyes and says, You don't owe the world perfection. You owe it your presence, and the world needs your presence with all its color, sound, and history. The room falls into tears, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of release. They are free now, because she spoke first. That evening she receives one final, unexpected visit. Barack Obama, now older, grayer, but still as warm and eloquent as ever, steps into her small home with a smile. He does not come as a former president, but as an old friend. "I just wanted to see the person who taught America how to listen," he says. They share tea in the quiet, laughing about the time the internet mistook her for a Supreme Court nominee. He leans back and looks at her thoughtfully. "You know, Adana, legacies aren't built in marble halls. They're built in rooms like yours." Later that year, Adana writes a book, her first. It's not a memoir, not a manifesto, but a guide. The voice within teaching, speaking and living without shame. It climbs bestseller lists translated into 19 languages, not because it is perfect, but because it is needed, and in time, Adana disappears from the public eye, not forgotten, but fulfilled. She lives quietly in a house lined with books and sunlit windows. Children play outside. Sometimes young teachers visit her seeking advice. She never turns them away. She always asks the same thing. "Tell me the story only your voice can tell." And when she finally passes peacefully in her sleep at age 81, the world mourns not just a teacher, but a truth-teller. Her funeral is held outdoors beneath a wide sky in dozens of languages, with no translator needed, because everyone there understands. On her headstone are just 5 words. She spoke. We listened forever. But even death could not quiet the voice of Adana Okwuosa. In the years that follow her passing, her influence blossoms into a movement quiet at first, like whispers through a classroom, then thunderous like a chorus no longer afraid to be heard. Schools around the world begin adopting a global speech initiative in her name. The Adana Method, a transformative framework that teaches language not through correction, but through connection. It encourages teachers to let students tell their stories first in their native language, then in English, building bridges between heritage and learning. Her book becomes required reading for educators across continents. In Uganda, a rural school renames itself Adana Academy of Voice and Justice in Tokyo. A young teacher opens her first class by saying, "Today we learn from a woman who taught us not to erase our roots. On the anniversary of her death, millions light candles on their windowsills, posting messages online with the words 'I speak,' because she did a feature-length documentary. Her accent carried nations, wins an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, chronicling the moment the gavel fell in that courtroom and the storm that rose from it." The film opens with footage of that viral trial and ends with an international summit where leaders quote her words at the United Nations. World leaders, presidents, poets, and children alike each carry a piece of Adana now. And then something unexpected happens. A statue, not of bronze or gold, not in a museum, but at the very steps of that courthouse where it all began. Sculpted in her likeness, she is shown standing tall, not shouting, not pointing, but simply teaching her hand extended in mid-gesture. Eyes, calm and resolute. At the base, no dates, just one line. Dignity needs no permission. Across the square, Judge Halverson, now in his 90s, frail and wheeled silently by, a nurse visits the statue alone one early morning. He sits for a long time, head bowed. No camera sees him. No press reports his visit. But when he leaves, he places a single white lily at her feet. For him, the gesture is too late. For the world, it is proof of how deeply she changed even the unwilling. Generations pass. Her students grow old, but her story is told again and again. A girl in Jakarta writes a poem titled, "My grandmother was taught by her a boy in New Orleans, wins a scholarship with an essay that begins. In a world that mocked her voice, she gave us ours." And far beyond Earth, when a Mars-bound education module is launched decades later to teach the next generation of explorers among the few books stored on board, digitized and preserved, is the voice within. Because even among the stars, they believe the first thing a child should learn is this: your voice is not an accident. It is your birthright. Use it always. But stories like Adana Okwuosa's don't end. They echo, 50 years after her death, in a world where languages blend through cities and accents flow freely through airwaves. A young girl named Lila Okwuosa stands backstage at the Global Literacy Congress in Geneva. Barely 16, she adjusts the gold pin on her chest, the shape of a book cracking open with wings, and holds a crumpled speech in her shaking hands. She bears the same determined eyes as the great-grandmother. She never met the same melodic cadence in her speech, though her accent is a patchwork Nigerian-British, a hint of Swiss-German. She's about to address leaders from over 100 countries, and though her voice trembles, she hears an echo in her mind. Tell me the story. Only your voice can tell. The words her family has passed down like scripture. She steps onto the stage beneath a wash of soft blue light, the audience falling silent, and begins not in English but in Igbo. Just one line. My name carries generations. Then she transitions fluidly, calmly, her speech weaving through languages and hearts. She doesn't ask for attention. She commands it. Just like Adana once did not by force but by truth. You once feared our accents. She says, now you teach your children to speak like us. Murmurs ripple through the room. Not discomfort, but recognition. Outside the Congress, a small garden has been constructed. The Garden of Voices, where speakers from every culture have planted native trees around a digital memorial. To Adana, press a button, and her courtroom speech plays in full, translated into every major language with the original audio-preserved raw and unfiltered children. Run past it each day on school field trips, some mimicking her cadence playfully, others pausing to listen. Truly listen. Her story has become curriculum not for pity, but for power. Meanwhile, universities across the globe have established Okwuosa fellowships for educators who uplift marginalized voices. Each fellow upon graduation receives a handwritten note digitally printed from Adana's preserved letters. One reads, "A teacher does not just light minds, they teach hearts to hear." In virtual space, her legacy lives on in the Okwuosa Archive, an AI-powered oral history bank that compiles stories from first-generation speakers worldwide. A child in Syria records her war poem. A boy in Appalachia shares a lullaby in broken English and Cherokee. The system responds not with correction, but with celebration, thanks to the algorithm coded from Adana's own teachings. And back in Washington Room 208 still stands preserved just as it was. Her desk remains her head wrap folded neatly on the chair. Teachers walk through it like a sacred museum. On the wall is a quote laser-etched into the wood, untouched by time. They tried to bury my voice, but it grew into a forest. One day, Layla returns there older, now wiser. She sits alone at the desk, her fingers brushing the worn edge. A little girl from the neighborhood peeks in. Curious. "Are you the lady in the video?" she asks. Layla smiles, shaking her head. No, but I carry her voice, and as the sun dips behind the schoolyard trees, casting gold through the dusty windows, the child sits beside her. 2 generations, 1 story, spoken again and again. And so the voice carries on through soil and memory code, and culture, blood and breath. Lila Okuosa, now in her 30s, leads a global coalition known as Project ECHO Educators for Cultural Harmony and Oralism, an initiative inspired by her great-grandmother's lifelong mission. The headquarters is not a tower, but a round glass building overlooking a lake in Nairobi, where students speak more than 70 languages before lunch. In the heart of the campus sits a sculpture garden, where each monument isn't of a leader, but of anonymous children with open mouths symbolizing the silenced and the newly heard. Layla travels constantly. Cairo, Jakarta, Sao Paulo, New York. Not to speak for people, but to hand them the microphone. In refugee camps and inner-city schools, she holds accent assemblies where children read aloud stories written in their home tongues, standing proudly as translators whisper beside them. Every session ends the same way, with a moment of shared silence honoring the woman who once stood trembling in a courtroom, her voice nearly dismissed before the world stood still to hear her. Meanwhile, the world's relationship with language has transformed. Smart devices no longer correct grammar. They adjust to cultural inflection. Speech training software no longer rewards flat accents, it learns the rise and fall of ancestral tone. And behind this shift is the foundational work of the Okuosa Protocol, a policy framework adopted by the UN and global education bodies to ensure linguistic equity. And yet for Layla, none of these honors compare to one moment each year on Adana's birthday. She returns to Enugu, Nigeria, to the modest home where Adana's ashes rest beneath the jacaranda tree. Their children gather with hand drums, paper scrolls, and honeyed words. They read aloud from books in Igbo, Swahili, Tagalog, and Spanish, some still stuttering, others singing, and at the end, as the sun sets and the wind gathers in the branches, one child is chosen to read a single line carved into the stone beneath the roots. Speak as you are, and you speak for all. In that garden, it is said the air still carries the warmth of Adana's breath. Elders claim that when the wind whistles just right, you can hear her laughter, light, defiant, and whole. Because some voices never fade. They simply become the ground we walk on, the wind that carries our stories, and the reason we speak louder, stronger, never again afraid. And still it continues. Decades turn to centuries. Technology reshapes the world. Holograms replace screens. Thought to text replaces keyboards, and yet in every generation, children are still taught to speak with courage. In the global education vault orbiting above Earth, known as the Lumen Sphere, a floating repository of humanity's greatest teachings, a section remains permanently illuminated. The Okuosa Legacy Archive. It contains every speech Adana ever gave, every lesson she ever taught, every child she ever empowered, preserved in perfect clarity, not for fame, but as a blueprint for justice. Her voice recorded in 4D immersive experience is still studied by scholars on Mars colonies and in lunar learning habitats where children of all colors and accents now say her name with reverence. Adana, the listener. Adana, the unshaken. One day, in a quiet garden under the crimson sky of Mars, a child named Kyan, a descendant of climate refugees, stumbles while reading a story aloud in front of his classmates. His voice cracks his accent thick. The others snicker. He nearly stops. But then the virtual instructor pauses the lesson. The classroom's walls dim. A holographic projection emerges from the archive. An aged but radiant Adana appears, smiling gently. Her eyes warm. Her voice calm as the Martian wind. "You do not need to sound like them," she says, her voice echoing softly. "You only need to sound like you." The class falls silent. Kian's shoulders rise. His chin lifts. He begins again, not flawlessly, but fiercely. When he finishes, the room claps, not because he was perfect, but because he was real. That moment spreads recorded and shared across solar systems. It becomes known as the second silence, not the one Adana endured, but the one she shattered, now shattered again across stars. The United Federation of Learning declares the date, Universal Voice Day in her honor, celebrated with story readings, accent fairs, and the lighting of voice lanterns in every known human settlement. On Earth, where the planet has healed from its former scars, Room 208 is no longer just a room. It has been turned into a global shrine, the temple of language and light. Children from all nations walk barefoot inside, where the floor glows softly with audio waves of voices from every age and tongue. At the very center lies a small wooden desk untouched for centuries. Above it, a beam of light falls onto a single phrase suspended mid-air in every known language. They tried to shame her tongue. She taught us to sing with it, and in the infinite stretch of time when historians search for the turning point, when humanity stopped correcting and started connecting, they trace it back to a single woman. Standing alone in a courtroom voice, trembling but rising as the world finally fell silent, not to judge her, but to listen. But even time cannot measure the full reach of a voice that taught the world to listen. 1,000 years have passed. Earth's skies are no longer polluted its nations, no longer divided by borders but connected by language itself, fluid, adaptive, alive. The human race now stretches far beyond its cradle cities, hover above oceans. Generations are born among the stars. But at the heart of every learning system, whether carved into memory crystals on Europa or sung through whisper chambers on Jupiter's moons, one name is still spoken with awe: Adana Okwuosa. She is no longer taught as a historical figure alone. She is revered as a symbol of linguistic freedom, emotional courage, and the soul of equity. On Gaia Terra, the great artificial habitat orbiting Saturn's rings, children enter school by passing beneath a towering sculpture. Adana, seated not on a throne but at her old wooden desk head, tilted one hand extended in welcome, the other resting on a book with the word voice embossed in 100 scripts. Every child, regardless of race, origin, biology, or species, begins their first lesson with what is now called the echo oath, spoken aloud in their native tone. I speak as I am, I honor the sounds that built me, and I promise to never silence another. Elsewhere in the interstellar archive of conscious memory, where artificial sentience is trained to understand humanity, Adana's case file is considered sacred code. AI beings study not just her courtroom moment, but her pauses, her tremors, her breath, learning that meaning does not only exist in language, but in courage. They refer to her not by name, but as the first listener. In the farthest quadrant of the known galaxy aboard the colony, Solstice Avum, a dying teacher named Mila transmits her final message to Earth's memory bank. Her voice is brittle but strong. When I was young, she says, they mocked the way I spoke, but then my mother told me about a woman who stood in a courtroom and changed the stars. And I've never stopped speaking since. Her recording is stored in the living choir, a galactic chorus of voices that now sings in billions of human and post-human dialects. Every cycle of the solar year always ending with the phrase, "Because she spoke, we remain." And deep beneath the soil of restored earth roots from the original jacaranda tree in Enugu, still bloom each spring. Its petals fall gently around a polished obsidian stone where no guards stand, no walls rise, just pilgrims of all kinds coming to listen to the wind that dances through the leaves. Some swear they hear her, not as a ghost, but as a beginning. And so, across centuries, across planets, across every known boundary, cultural, linguistic, even biological, the voice of Adana Okwuosa lives on. Not in echoes of applause, but in the quiet courage of children reading aloud without shame. In teachers who no longer correct identity. In courtrooms where silence no longer means submission. Her legacy is not stone or steel. It is breath. It is sound. It is every voice that rises now without fear. Because once a woman stood alone and refused to lower hers, in the final archive, where the last stories of Earth are stored to guide the future, there is only one message carved in gold above the entrance. She taught the universe one truth. Our voices are never too broken to be heard. And now, if her story moved you, if you believe in justice and dignity, in the power of one voice to change everything, subscribe to this channel. Support stories that matter. Share voices that deserve to be heard. Click, subscribe, and turn on notifications because the world still needs to listen. Your voice matters. Let's make sure the world hears it.